Hey everyone, so over the summer we started reading The Littles, and I have a second Littles book for you. So the first story was the first one in a series. So there's a bunch of different Littles stories, and this is actually the second book. And if you look at the title, it's called The Littles Take a Trip. So I'll read it just one chapter at a time so you can listen to the story. And then I'll just show you the pictures as we go. So it's still by John Peterson. And the pictures are by Roberta Carter Clark. I know it's kind of hard to see the pictures because they're black and white, but I'll just show them up to the camera. So here are some of our main characters. They might be familiar to you guys. I don't know if you remember any of them. It looks like we have Lucy here. Maybe Mr. and Mrs. Little up here. Looks like their uncles hanging out over here. There's also some characters on the back. Do you remember these characters? This was a big part of that first story, that cat. Looks like the cat's still hanging around. We have Grandma Little hanging off the cat. Looks like there's Tom who's pulling the cat by her leash. We're going to jump right in and we'll get started. Alright, so chapter 1. Tom Little and his sister Lucy were not invited to Henry Bigg's birthday party, but they went anyway. They always went to Henry's parties. They had gone to them for as far back as they could remember. Henry did not know that Tom and Lucy were there. They watched from a secret lookout place above the dining room door. Now, if you guys think back, we learned a few things about the Littles. They're not your average people. Does anyone remember what's special about them? This picture is kind of giving you a hint. Yeah, just like their name says, they're really little. So they're short little people. Also, you can kind of see that they have some tails. And we learned that they live in the Biggs' house. But they live there in secret. So Mr. and Mrs. Big don't even know that they're there. And they kind of hide out in the walls. And it sounds like our story is starting out. And it's Henry Bigg's birthday party. Tom and Lucy were the children of Mr. and Mrs. William T. Little. All the Littles were tiny people. They weren't midgets or dwarfs or even elves. They were tinier than that. Mr. Little was the tallest Little, and he was only 6 inches tall. He was like this. All the other Littles were shorter than he was. The Little family lived in the walls of the house owned by the Big family. Their 10 small rooms took up only a tiny little space. The Big family didn't know that the Littles were living with them. The tiny people always kept out of sight. Except for being tiny, the Littles looked exactly like ordinary people. The Littles were different in one way. Remember what it was? They had tails. The Littles' tails weren't used for anything. They couldn't hang by their tails or use them to swat flies, but they were handsome tails, and the Littles were proud of them. They kept them combed and brushed, and the women curled their tails and often wore ribbons on them. As Tom and Lucy watched Henry Big and his family, Lucy said, They look silly without their tails." She started giggling and couldn't stop. "Be quiet," said Tom Little. "They might hear you." "I can't help it," said Lucy. She held her hand over her mouth. "Besides, it's not important," said Tom. "They're not having tails, I mean." "If it's not important, then why do we have them?" said Lucy. "Because we do, that's all," said Tom. "We're the same. They're only a little smaller. People are people." "No, we're not the same," said Lucy. "If we were, we'd have parties too, and we'd invite friends to come." So if you see them, they're kind of hiding behind the wall, and they're spying on the party. They want to see what's going on. When Lucy said that, Tom forgot he was having fun watching Henry Biggs' party. His sister was right. Tom and Lucy never saw any children their age and their size. Of course, Tom and Lucy were good friends. They liked each other, but both of them wanted more than anything to have a friend outside the family. Tom, who was 10 years old, wanted to play astronaut and other boys' games with a boy his age. And Lucy, age 8, longed to have a girlfriend to play house with and talk to. Even so, Tom and Lucy weren't exactly lonely. Sometimes Uncle Pete played with them as if he were a boy. That was fun, and Granny Little was teaching Lucy all she knew about sewing and knitting, which was all there was to know. But today, Tom and Lucy were watching Henry Biggs' birthday party and feeling sorry for themselves. "You're right, Lucy," said Tom. "We must be different from Henry Biggs because we never play with other kids." "That's not fair," said Lucy. "Cousin Dinky gets to see all the other families. Why can't we?" "Cousin Dinky is an adventurer," said Tom. "Dad says he takes a lot of chances. He could get killed." "I thought you said you wanted to be just like Cousin Dinky when you grow up." "I do," said Tom, "but I'm not grown yet." "Anyway," said Lucy, "if there were another family like ours living in the Biggs house with us, it wouldn't be so lonely. Why do we have to live so far away from other tiny families? I hate it." "Oh, well, we have to," said Tom. "There's not supposed to be more than one family in a house. Dad told us 100 times. That way, the big people will probably never find out about any of us." "I don't see what's so important about that," said Lucy. "Golly, Lucy, don't be silly," said Tom. "That's very important. They might not like the way that we take the things that we need from them, like food and, well, everything else." "What would happen if they knew about us?" "Maybe they'd put us in a museum," said Tom, "or a circus." "So what?" said Lucy. "At least that would be more exciting than sitting here and watching." "And maybe they'd kill us," said Tom. "They might think we were some kind of animal." He looked at his tail. "Kill us?" said Lucy. Well, maybe," said Tom. "Gee, I don't really know what they do. I'm sorry I said that. They probably wouldn't kill us." "Oh, Tom," said Lucy, "I did a terrible thing. I gave Henry Biggs a birthday card. Now they'll find out about us and kill us." "You what?" said Tom. He jumped up. I made a birthday card for Henry. It's there." She pointed on the table in the Biggs dining room, the one with the presents. "Did you write anything in it? Did you tell him about us?" "Not on the card, no," said Lucy. "Well, at least you had that much sense." "But I did in the letter that I wrote." "Letter? What letter?" "I put a letter on the table too, Tom." "We will be killed. Oh, Tom." Tom Little dashed from the lookout place and ran to the tin can elevator. The Little has made an elevator from a soup can and some pieces of string. The boy rode in the elevator down to the dining room floor. Tom pushed open a secret door and walked into the Biggs dining room. Tom was standing under the small table with the presents. He looked at the children. They were busy playing pin the tail on the donkey. Tom climbed the electric cord of the table lamp without being seen. The tabletop was covered with presents and birthday cards. Tom looked through the envelopes as quickly as he could. It wasn't easy. Most of the cards were bigger than he was. As he looked, Tom kept an eye on the children. One of the boys had just tried to pin the donkey's tail on Mrs. Big. At last, Tom found his sister's letter. All right, So Tom tries to rescue the letter and he jumps in the elevator. You see it there? It's like a little can, and then it's attached to a string so he can go up and down. He had to go down to where their secret door is to get to the kitchen. He snatched it up. Now where was that birthday card? Mrs. Big spoke. That's enough games for a while, children, she said. Now let's open presents. Then we can have cake and ice cream. When Tom heard that, he jumped into the pot of English ivy that was on the table. He hid behind the leaves. Why, he thought. Tom, why, oh why am I wearing a red shirt instead of a green one? He tried to wrap himself in a leaf. Poor little Tom. He had to stay hidden in that pot of English ivy until Henry Big opened all of his cards and presents. There he is. So right as he was looking for that card that Lucy wrote, all the kids were coming over to open presents, so he had to hide. Do you see him? He's like wrapped in that leaf. Tom hoped that Lucy was watching. All this trouble was her fault. How strange, said Mrs. Big, when Henry got to Lucy's card. It's so tiny, and it's homemade. Who's Lucy Little? Said Henry Big. Nobody knew, of course. That's crazy, said Henry. He went on to the other cards and presents. Later, Lucy told Tom she was awfully sorry, and would he please not tell their mom and father? She would never do it again. Tom said he would think it over. He didn't want to be a tattletale, but Lucy had done a terrible thing. And that is the end of chapter 1. So far, we've met our characters. We know we have the Littles family. So we have Tom and Lucy, who are the kids, their mother and father. Then they have Uncle Pete, that guy there, and the grandma. And just like in the first book, we know that they're living in the Biggs' house, and they live there in secret, so the Biggs don't know that they're there. And at the start of our book, it's Henry's birthday. And Lucy, she decided to write him a card, but there she is. But then Tom tried to rescue it because they have to keep their existence a secret, and he was afraid that the card would give too many hints about who they were.